Eric, you have a question? Oh, sorry.
Oh, I was just thinking of discussion we had at the conference about whiteness and how that definition has changed over time.
Right.
And how, in many cases, Asian Americans will be looked at as kind of approaching whiteness.
Right.
And how that kind of categorization could kind of whitewash.
Right,
history.
it makes even more, right?
It's like, but we're all accepted, we're all together now, and then history is kind of washed away.
Yeah, so the Harvard case, that's exactly what's going on. The people who are suing Harvard, even with, there's real racism in Harvard like everywhere else. We get that. That's true. The recent immigrants that are suing Harvard, mostly Chinese Americans, mostly privileged, they don't realize the history of racism, so they're being played by the Republican operative who basically is going to use this case now to get rid of affirmative action. So this whole group of Asian American scholars, all the scholars who are like, no, don't do that. Now this group doesn't really get a lot of airplay in the news because it doesn't sound that good. It sounds as though, there's this racial tension or whatever. But all the Asian American scholars I know who are scholars, they have been fighting these people and saying, stop. That's not how you fight this racism. You can't get rid of affirmative action. We have to keep this thing and still fight it in different ways. But what you can't do is use it in such a way that it's going to hurt other people, because in the end, it'll come back to you as well. So those are the dynamics of what's happening right now. But if you don't understand the complexity of how these layers are, and the fact that there's so many Asian American scholars who know, and they're saying, this is a terrible idea, but these people who are suing Harvard, you won't get that history. You won't get that in the news. And that's why it's really, really problematic. It's a single narrative of Asian Americans who are coming. They're all pretty much white anyways, so now they're hurting the other minorities, when in fact it's not true. Asian Americans who know history are like, you don't know enough history to understand why this is getting rid of affirmative action is a problem. I think those things are really, even as Asian Americans are getting, to some degree, becoming more minority. I think that's the background. People who know the history will think very differently about that. Thank you. What all this about enlarging, history of white people, Neil Painter's book, she talks about all this different stuff. Now, but it was written during Obama years to some degree, so it's very different in terms of its final tone. I think it would be different if it was written now, right? So the last chapter, how he thinks about it it's just slightly different. And there are a lot of books that were written during Obama years. Like there's a book called Racial Formation in America, which is a great book, by the way, sociologically explaining race, right? It was the first edition. It's sixth edition or whatever, ninth edition. But there's an earlier edition that ended with the Obama era, and it's very different. And then they said, okay, now this is happening now. So that's interesting as well, the fact that how much things have changed, and also seeing the fact that how that was a superficial understanding of this post-racial world or whatever.
I just wanted to make a comment. I didn't realize how whitewashed when I was going through K through 12, I didn't know how whitewashed the presentation of history was until I came here. I'm from Nashville, and I have family over in Arkansas, and I did not know about the Little Rock Nine until I took Hop Jun Lee's class a couple of years ago, and I didn't, in this past year, if you haven't done this, I highly recommend that you go to the Chinese American Museum in downtown Union Station, because I was like shocked to find out about the lynchings, because they were talking about that, and then like so many of the railroad workers were killed in accidents and stuff, but they wanted to return their bodies to China. And when I read about that for one of my classes, but it didn't become real to me until I saw a box like that on display, and it's just like, wow. And I remember like having a conversation with my uncle, especially like about the Little Rock Nine, and he said, well, here's a question we all gotta live by. What side of history do you want to be remembered? And on what side of history do you want to be remembered by? You know, do you want to be remembered as a silent majority or somebody that stood up and did something about it? You know, yeah. So I'm just glad that at Fuller, you know, I'm getting more than a theological education. So yeah.
And if anyone has a comment online, just speak up.
Yeah. Write it down.
Yeah.
Daniel, one point of clarification. Did you say that in addition to the Japanese Americans being a possible threat during World War II,
Yeah.
that California farmers,
But economic reasons.
okay,
Yeah,
they're saying,
economic
hey,
reasons, yeah.
they're taking our land.
Yeah. Or they're actually farming with this land that we have. They're actually producing too much because they're better farmers than us, basically.
Oh, okay. So then they appeal to the government to do something
Politically.
politically. So then so they got included in the encampment too. That they were taken away basically.
Okay.
I mean these farmers.
No, there were a lot of farmers, Japanese American farmers.
Correct.
So when they ended up leaving, they lost their farm, and then white people took their farms, basically.
But then the impetus of them being taken was not so much they were threat.
Yeah, there was no, in the end, the report came because there was an exhaustive report, and they said there was no threat. It was hysteria, and there were other political, economic reasons.
Okay, so meaning, okay, so they wanted them to go.
Yeah.
So they can take the land.
Yeah.
It sounds similar to like when people talk about the cause of the Civil War, or was it economics, or was it, you know, states' rights, or was it protecting slavery? It's like one is a real thing and then the other is a cover.
Right. It's a real
for that.
racism.
And
then you have different languages talking about it.
Yeah, exactly.
That's exactly what it is.
Exactly.
They don't want them around. They want to keep America white. That's literally what people were talking about, right? So, and then this is the great opportunity. I mean, if you look up this idea of battle, I think it's battle over LA. What ended up happening was there were some, I think it was like some air balloons or whatever. They thought it was an invasion. The hysteria was so high that the guns went off and they were shooting for like an hour or something. And then they realized there was no invasion. There was nothing. People freaked out. They were shooting in the air. I mean, that's how high the hysteria was. It was just, so when you have this hysteria and there's nobody that's going to calm people and help people around, that the racism just kind of overflows, right? And then there are other people that you don't want anyways, so therefore you use all those things to justify it. I mean, you know, the Supreme Court cases, every branch failed. Every branch failed doing what happened with the Japanese American incarceration. So you look at that and you say, you know, what happened? Like, how can it go so wrong? But that's our history. We have to at least know about that to do something with it, at least, right? I mean, I think the question is about how much does that impact us. Those are open questions. There's no question about this, the fact that it actually happened. We actually have to know what it is in order to think about, and we can discuss about the fact that this is a legacy of this or that. But you can't have an argument about did it really happen or not. That's just ignorance, right? And that's what's happening, I think, in so much of our country as well. I mean, legally, there's a book called White by Law. It just shows you legally the fact that whiteness wasn't a cultural thing; it was a legal entity. The courts actually decided what white was not, right? So, and how that gave you particular privileges and powers. The privileges and power thing is not like some cultural thing. It was a legal entity that was very concrete that you can't argue because it's just historic, right? If we don't even know that, and we start talking about white privilege, then it seems as though it's just a cultural thing we kind of kick around, which is not what this is. It actually has very concrete historical roots. And that's what I'm saying. How do we do theology? Not just by talking about culture. Well, culturally, we're different. That's actually the foundation of multiculturalism. And multiculturalism didn't want to talk about structures and power. That's what the whole thing failed. It wasn't talking about white supremacy. It was like, well, here's white culture, here's black culture, here's Asian culture. Instead of thinking, these things have long histories. It was a particular form of propaganda.
So I have a comment. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, this is Alice online.
Yeah, let's have you.
Hey, it's interesting thinking about history, especially some of these things where, well, that's not it's not my personal history, right? Well, my parents weren't that generation, or my
Right.
family wasn't devastated by that, although I can see how some of society still has kind of holdovers of racism from those policies, or social problems from those policies, or even like white normativity, that's kind of goes unquestioned. But maybe turning it in the other way, what do you think about, like, how do I engage? Like, I have a white friend who literally told me, I'm not sending my kids to college unless they want to go, because college is just going to tell them that, they're the problem of all these things, and they weren't even born yet.
Yeah, I mean, once again, I think we can talk about the fact that how the particular legacies impact and what are the historical echoes of these things. I think those can be discussions, I think. But I think what ends up happening is I mean, like, for example, like that book, like White by Law. I mean, it's not just slavery. It's just knowing the fact that legally U.S. has protected this category of white for a long time. So, and it's actually it's really recent. It's not like hundreds of years ago, right? So I think in that sense, it's just ignorance, like pure ignorance. It's a particular propaganda to kind of hide these things. Now, given the fact that this was a legal system, and I mean, there are concrete law cases you can kind of look to. Given that, how do we make sense of that? That's an open question, I think. That's an open question. We can talk about that. Like, in what sense does it kind of propagate? And there are ranges of that. There are ranges, I think, that are more realistic than others, right? And you have to kind of think about where your location is. Thinking, well, if you haven't experienced it, then does that mean it's not real? So I think sometimes when I teach, I talk about, I distinguish between individual personal experiences and kind of sociological realities. Even though some people, and this is a discussion we just had at Dean's Cabinet, there's some students who are like, you know what? I think why are we talking about race? I'm a black person. I don't think it's that important. I'm like, I can affirm that for you. They're just deeper historical structures, things that we have to understand. And you can locate yourself given the fact that this is history and this is basically what the structures are. And I can still affirm the fact that that's been your experience and you navigate the world in a particular way. I'm not going to rob that from you saying, well, you should. I'm like saying, just be aware of what this is and how you're navigating the world. Because I don't want to be like, you want to be careful about respecting at least their particular personal history. I think it's important. If you rob all that stuff, then you'll really disorient people. But to say, look, these structural, broader, contextual, sociological things, these things, you just have to learn them. Why? Because you're not going to learn it through experience. Learning these things will give you lens to talk about these things. Mm-hmm. And if you don't have them, of course, they don't exist because you don't have words to describe it anyways, right? I think for your, Alice, for your friend, I think, once again, like, these things are not history as an ancient history. These are repeated histories too. Like, you see literally the same kind of policy being repeated, in 100 years. So I think, the question is, we can still say there are all kind of complicated racial politics, and some of these, are not constructive because people are so traumatized and they're very angry, and rightly so, absolutely rightly so. But sometimes it's just hard to sit there and learn in the midst of all this stuff. So yes, understand. At the same time, how do we actually learn about what reality of America is and was? And just because we don't know it doesn't mean it disappears. Like, we can't change the past. Like, these things actually happen. Like, U.S. was an imperial power. It still is, right? So if you're Puerto Rican, it's very plain. If you don't know anybody Puerto Rican, you don't even know the fact that we have this whole country that we're actually holding. That's a really weird reality, right? Are we an imperial power or not? Well, that's just a fact that we are. Now, what does that mean? Well, it depends on who you are, right? And how you think it impacts you. But no matter what your experience is, I mean, we just are imperial power. We own Guam. Why do we own Guam, right? How did we take over Hawaii? History of Hawaii is just the most egregious in terms of what American missionaries and even the Turkish missionaries did. The best lands in Hawaii are owned by progeny of American missionaries who ended up living in Hawaii. And they took over the land. They used that privilege. So you look at all that stuff and you're like, well, that's our history. What do you do? I think the doing is a bit more complicating, but you can't do it without knowing history.
Yeah.
Then you're just blind.
I agree.
You're just trying to figure it out by yourself and using the language of culture, which is a culprit, which is a bad thing. Oh, culturally we're different. Hawaiians, they're just different. One of my favorite things is Filipinos, they get along with everybody. Well, if you've been colonized for 500 years, maybe you just get along with everybody because you're used to it.
Yeah.
But is that culture? That's a terrible way of explaining what culture, what the difference is. What you're seeing of the phenomena you're seeing can't be explained just by cultural difference in a very narrow sense. It's so common, and especially in the evangelical world, because we like culture. Culture's safe. Race, structures, colonization, that is like, do we want to talk about that?
Yeah.
But that's why we got a half-baked or we got an incomplete picture and incomplete solutions for what's happening. So hopefully that kind of helps Alice in terms of, I think, how do you first understand the issue in terms of historically how it's developed? And then you can think about theologically, history, strategically, what do you do as well? And those are different things. You can't disagree with somebody else about strategy, about in terms of what you think is happening, explanation of how that legacy continues on. But if you're not agreeing on what actually happened and you're ignoring history, then you're talking about somebody who actually understands history, and you're talking about somebody who just understands propaganda. Well, at that point, you're not going to have a decent discussion.
Right.
Which is what's
I
happening.
hear you saying, yeah. So have to have a good grip on the facts and the reality before you can go from there.
Right. And just say, there are these books, they're just historical books, right? There's history of this thing. And you can still argue and say, well, you think you have it, you can still have a discussion about how much it impacts and what do you do and what does it even mean to kind of carry that burden of being like, this is your white, guilt about the whole thing. We can still talk about the dynamics of that, I think. But you can't ignore the fact that the whiteness as a legal category is a real thing. There's still a legacy to this thing with the people, with the demographics of this country. Why? I guess it's changing. Why is Congress the way that it is? Why is certain departments and certain fields more white dominated? That's a question. Like, we can actually have a discussion about these things and particular histories of how those disciplines, that field has been dominated by a particular kind of a history and particular kind of racial dynamics. That's really helpful. Now it's something concrete. It's not just like, hey, I think white people have been terrible forever. I'm like, that doesn't really help. It's too vague, right? It's too vague to talk about what we're talking about. And I think, and that kind of vague language can be done, used from anybody, right? Asian Americans, Black people, everybody can use that kind of vague language. The question is, how do you articulate well? No, just because you articulate well, it doesn't mean people are going to listen. Or even if you have facts on your side, it doesn't mean people are going to listen. But at least we can try to sit there and do this thing and continue to try to have this struggle of kind of people knowing history.
Yeah. Do we know exactly where that plaque is?
Oh yeah. If you go to Pasadena on Mills Place, and it's by Colorado, there's a little plaque right there, and you'll see it.
Okay.
Yeah, it's by Colorado, right? And then from Colorado, it goes all the way to Green, right? Colorado to Green. So on the Colorado side, it's actually over there. And if you look around, there's a plaque, yeah. And when I saw it, I was like, what in the world, right? Just wow! I lived in Pasadena for this long, and I didn't even know the fact that there was this history. I'll send you the article because it was an article on Pasadena Times or whatever. I don't know. You haven't.
Yeah.
Right? So you can actually send it over to different people and say, this is the article that shows literally what the history of this is.
Yeah.
And, just people have no idea what. And then I see there's another, I think, LA Times article that before about lynchings in LA, one of the biggest lynchings in America. Why it was actually against Chinese and what it looked like and how it was like open season. People were just killing Chinese people, and they couldn't testify, right? Because of the particular law that was there. So you look at that, and you're like, that is really crazy. Like, and this is our history. This is LA history, right? And we live here now. So it's not like, oh, of course, it's everywhere, right? In different stories that we have. It's not those terrible people over there, that state. California is not this enlightened place. It's a very recent phenomenon.
Yeah.
Our history is not like that. And we have to know that. And California and LA, Angelinos have to keep on remembering that. If you forget that, we're like, oh yeah, of course, those, Texans or whatever, right? Not true.
Yeah.
Not true.
Yeah.
It is not true.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I just.
Wait a minute, let me have.
I just had a question regarding to your earlier statement about how our attitude towards the centers on campus is so different if we think of them as like a refuge for students of that ethnicity.
It can be that, of course. It should be that as well. But
so I was wondering what you envision or what is happening with the Asian American Center to help us grow and
this quarter in the Asian American Identity and Ministry class, 1/3 of that class, Helen knows, is non-Asian American.
1/3.
Yeah, 1/3, which is actually I've never had it that big. But I mean, it's good because we always said these classes are not for only Asian Americans, and you will not be treated like guests here. Like you're not, oh, it's so cute. Oh, I mean, it's not like that because sometimes it'll be like, why are you here, right? So how do we kind of keep, and I think pedagogically we thought about that before because we knew the fact that we will have non-Asian Americans there, and of course because if you live in cities, there are a lot of Asian Americans around, and they don't know. So I told this African Americans in Texas, I said, you know what's weird? You're gonna know about more about Asian Americans than Asian Americans know themselves. Because if they're educated here, they're going to use the same categories that the white America gave them, and they won't be able to explain these things. Whereas I'm giving you all the nuanced language. I think things like that, how do we keep on saying, this is not just for Asian Americans. We live in this world. We need better tools. I think as I teach different things, how do I keep on doing that? So that, and the fact that I kind of wear this Asian American Center hat helps me continually have this in the front. The struggle with Asian American scholars, and actually a lot of Asian American scholars even at Fuller, is that, how do you get established? By doing mainstream white stuff. That's how you get established academically. So if you focus on that, Asian American stuff ends up being a hobby, right? Like, well, when I have time, I'll work on this thing. But Asian American stuff is really, really complicated. And there's a whole discipline. People get PhDs on a very particular aspect of Asian American experience. So when you have Asian American scholars or even professionals here who haven't really dug into, and if they did, would it benefit their professional career? It might not. It might be like, why are you working on that, when you should be working on, I don't know, New Testament or whatever. Do you see what I'm saying? So the fact that I have to officially wear Asian American thing makes that my job to do Asian American stuff. And I realize that's been a great privilege. The fact that Fuller as an institution has invested in that. And it's helping make sure that this is not some side project. Like I actually interact with Asian American studies overall. I think, continuing, a couple of years ago, we did this whole trip to Manzanar. We actually took a bus and went to Manzanar. I mean, that was, because it turns out that if you go to Manzanar, the Muslim community has been going there for the last, over, more than a decade, like 2 dozen years or whatever, 20 years or so. It's been a long time because they realized that the Muslim, especially after September 11th, how they're going to be treated might be very similar to Japanese Americans. And Japanese Americans only Japanese Americans who remember history, they supported the Muslim community from the very beginning, even before September 11th. It turned out the fact that they actually have been always supporting them, and a lot of Muslim Americans have been learning from them. Like imams will come, they'll bring whole youth group to Manzanar camp and say, this can happen to us, you better learn history. I mean, that's how powerful it is. Wow. Last time we went, I think about a quarter were all Muslim. That's how big Muslim communities, right? Before Trump got elected, there was a huge rise in people going to these camps. And you know what they kept on saying? The visitor kept on saying to Rangers, how does this work? Well, what do you mean? Can it work now? And the Rangers what are you talking about? We have these historical sites to remember what we did worse. And they're like, yeah, but can it work now? These people they're getting tons of visitors saying, can we have something like this for Muslims? What does it look like? Or maybe Mexican. So the Rangers were all they were freaking out. They're like, this is not what this is, right? This is not here's a showcase of what we did in the past. And then even some of the politicians said, well, we did in the past. I mean, I think there were particular cases where people were saying, well, can't we do something? We did it in the past. Why can't we do it now? I can't remember who the senator or congressman was, but there was this discussion that people were having. They weren't repenting of it. They were saying, oh, that's a case study of what we've done. Maybe we can do it again.
Well, the Korematsu case is still good law. It hasn't been overruled. So that's key to remember. So, I mean, it's like those things could still happen, you know?
Wait,
But
explain more for those of us who are not.
so
Yeah,
Did Congress issue an apology within like the past 2 decades about
well, I
Korematsu?
think they issued an apology, but the Korematsu case is the Supreme Court case that said that it was perfectly legal and permissible for the government to have imprisoned Japanese people following or during World War II. And it is everyone acknowledges it's like a shameful case. It's a mark on the judiciary, all of those things. But no subsequent cases, the court has not overturned that ruling.
Because
So
there's been no reason for it to have been challenged.
Right,
Yeah.
exactly. So, but it's still just important to remember that the holding in the Korematsu case is still good law.
Yeah.
That is still the law of the land.
History, once again.
Mm-hmm.
Like just history.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, when you learn the details of this thing, you say, and of course, what ended up happening, I mean, there was layers and layers of stuff, like in terms of what happened with the camps, how the Japanese American community kind of dealt with it, different camps within different factions within the Japanese American community, how they were treated with each other. I mean, I think all that stuff, I mean, it's so fascinating to learn and also to kind of think about how do we navigate these things? How do we navigate, how do we treat each other in the midst of these things? I think, like, people who live in California, they've never been, like a lot of people who actually went to visit, like, with us, even a lot of our faculty and students, they've never even, knew the fact that it was there. Like, just, they heard some echoes of it. So, I think it's why Fuller Studios recorded the whole thing. I think what we're trying to do so getting back to your question, I think what we're trying to do is making that trip more regular, like things like that. And along with that, how do we keep on raising voices? And then how do we continue to work together more closely with the center so that it's not just ethnic studies for different people, but we're trying to raise something about solidarity, about subjectivity, about liberation. And I mean, do it all theologically, obviously, right? This is not just politics. We need to have a decent grasp of reality. And then we have to say, what does the gospel say to this thing? And it can't just be like, well, we all just forgive and forget. I mean, that's not going to be beneficial. What does the kingdom look like? That's the continual journey, a continual struggle, I think, for all of us. And so that's what it looks like.
Is there another trip planned coming up soon, or
was it next year or next year?
I believe 2020.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I think we'll go at least every 5 years, but we're trying to put a trip in between. So it's like every 2-3 years. So there's always, and then we can kind of see, because last time we went, it was a 75th, commemoration of it. And, we go, I mean, you can always go by yourself. At the end of April, last Saturday of April, they always have this annual Day of Remembrance. And when you go, they have a whole ceremony, all this different stuff. They have speakers, talk about these things. And if you go by yourself, it's very different because there's nobody there. It's beautiful, and also you get the feeling like, oh, it's beautiful to camp. Nobody wants to live here. It is a terrible place to live. It's freezing. It's super hot. It's super dusty, right? So, just the dynamics of all that stuff and stuff. But if you want to go where they have actually this Day of Remembrance, it's actually last Saturday of April. They do it every year. If you go though, make sure you stay for the official kind of ceremony, but don't stay for the service. That goes on for a long time.
Yeah.
And they have like long Shinto prayers that go, a Buddhist prayer that go for like 30 minutes. Don't stay for that. Go visit everything else, because I think that's okay, but it's not great. If you stay for that, it'll eat up too much of your time. So go for the first part of the ceremony where they have speakers and testimonies and where they have flags of the different different camps and everything else. I think that's really moving. And then go and start looking at everything else. If you go that day, it'll be very crowded. If you go other days, there's literally nobody there. But right now it's closed because the government's closed.
Yeah.
So
Right.
that's where we are.
Yeah. So the next trip that the Asian American Center and Fuller will be organizing will be April 2020. So next school year.
Okay.
Also, one thing that the Student Fellowship and us, so Dean's one of the co-leaders of the Student Fellowship and the Asian American Center, some point this spring, our friend Bill Watanabe, who was actually born in the incarceration camp and is a community leader in Little Tokyo. He founded the Little Tokyo Service Center. he's going to be taking us on a history walk
Oh wow.
of Little Tokyo,
Yeah.
Oh,
which
wow.
includes a lot of people don't know this. The plaza in front of the Japanese American National Museum is actually where the buses came to take. It was the gathering point to go to the incarceration camp.
Oh my God.
So he's going to walk us through some of that history. So if you're interested in that, feel free to follow up with the Asian American Center or the Student Fellowship.
Yeah.
That's going to be 2020.
So
No.
2020 is the
Okay.
Seminar trip.
Yeah. This one
This
is.
spring
This that one.
will be Bill's
Do that.
walk
Okay.
to Little Tokyo.
Yeah.
He knows
This
everything.
spring. This spring.
Yeah,
Yes.
that's this spring. It's like a couple months, right? So
Okay.
Bill Watanabe is amazing. He knows, he's a very unassuming man, but he knows everything about Little Tokyo. And I think you can literally see these places. He'll point to what the buildings were, how they fought for different things, how the police, I mean, there's so much things there that you'll learn. So I think it's really good. So, yeah.
Yeah, I wanna-
Uh,
I wanna-
what are some more practical ways that non-Asian Americans can be able to live out the solidarity of the historical elements that we've talked about? There's a difference between people knowing their history, learning things, being educated, and then realizing that even the Asian Americans that you interact with may or may not even know what you know. There's so much of that whitewashing that's happened, or I call it brainwashing that's happened, that the reality is that you knowing is only one part of the equation.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's true.
I mean, I think, in front of us, it's just continuing, just, supporting different things, and saying, I mean, this is how critical race theory describes it. It's called pure white approval. For Asian Americans and other minorities, if it's not good enough for white people, it's not good enough for them. It's like, well, I want what white people get, right? So that's basically why a lot of Asian Americans don't take Asian American classes. They're like, well, why do I have to talk about identity? Like, white people don't talk about it. Or they'll say, this is one student will say, this is Asian American professor class. Yeah, I heard it's really good. Even the white students say it's good. And I'm like, why does it matter? Because you need that approval. You need that affirmation. If a white chef doesn't present it, is it really real? If a white artist doesn't really introduce it, does it really exist? This is how dynamics of cultural, appropriation kind of works as well. This is kind of, so I think in one sense, how do, no matter who we are, really have a deeper understanding of our own history, right? Saying, oh, I'm not just a generic normal human being. I have a particular history. So I think for a lot of white people, I think the question is, how do you understand the white studies? Kind of go deeper on that, and really have a very deep, good understanding of that. And that's an encouragement to everybody in saying, well, how do we kind of know all of who we are? I mean, one of the biggest things that I'm trying to do in curriculum at Fuller is saying who all of us we are, who we are individually, matters. It's not so much the fact that we more Black studies or Asian American studies. I need white people to understand what it means to be white. Then they can kind of be in different places to realize this is what solidarity means. This is my history. Then you become somebody who understands what's going on. There was a student group in Austin, Texas, huge Asian American kind of InterVarsity chapter. And they're like, well, shouldn't we have a role in racial reconciliation? I was like, yes, if you know who you were, if you know your history, yes. But if you don't know history and if you don't know who you are dangerous. What are you going to say, right? You're going to say stuff like, oh, it's great. We're so privileged and Black people are not. Really? You have no idea what your history is. I mean, that's a relative statement, right? There's some privilege, but do you understand what the history is and do you have a deeper understanding of where you find yourself? I think that's basically what I would say. And then continuing to kind of find support ways, right? Support ways that you can kind of learn about the world that we live in, whether it be Hispanic stuff. I mean, Latino, Central Latino, Pinal Center, Asian Americans, all these different things, I think, and kind of make a connection that's broader than just, oh, here are the different cultures. Drop the language of just cultural difference. That's real. We affirm that, but thinking about it that way without the historical genealogies makes it incomprehensible. It's just not true because you're getting a modern snapshot of this longer historical trajectory, and that's very okay. Well, here's Crazy Rich Asians. It's great. I'm like, but what's the history? What's the history of Yellow Peril? What's the history of Orientalism in American cinema? Then you understand where this fits in. But even a lot of Asian Americans don't know about that either, right? So
Mhm.
as we know about that, we can kind of help each other out all together.